saying they'd been purely preparatory. Yeltsin said, "I did not."
Don't wear them. Oh, do you want him to wear them?
Yeah.
Okay, then if you're comfortable.
206.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm David Hilfiger, a physician from the inner city of Washington, D.C., and you're listening to New York and Company with Leonard Lopate on WNYC AM 820, New York Public Radio.
Hundreds of thousands of people with irregular heartbeats were introduced to a new drug in the mid-'80s, the first widespread prescription drug from the 3M company, an antiarrhythmic called Tambicor. Researchers believe that Tambicor and drugs like it would prevent cardiac arrest, but even in the early testing stages, there were doubts about Tambicor's benefits. There was some evidence that it could kill more patients than it would save. In fact, according to my first guest, antiarrhythmics like Tambicor may have killed as many as 50,000 heart patients in just a few years. Thomas J. Moore investigated the drug companies, researchers, and the FDA to get to the bottom of this story. His third book on the medical industry is called Deadly Medicine: Why Tens of Thousands of Heart Patients Died in America's Worst Drug Disaster. It's published by Simon & Schuster. Thomas J. Moore joins me now on New York & Company. Good afternoon.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, that 50,000 death figure, that's a number that is really startling. If 50,000 people died from anything, I would think it would be a headline story.
It is truly a shocking figure. It is also shocking to me that the greatest disaster in our history occurred, and it fell to me, a relatively lonely health policy researcher, to investigate it.
Now, this is more than the losses in Vietnam, more than all the people who've died from commercial airline crashes in the history of this country.
It is truly a staggering death toll. It seems to me it makes us think differently about a medical system that brings us wonderful benefits, that is also able to create catastrophes of an almost unimaginable scale.
Now, how did you arrive at the figure of 50,000 people? Were these people who had their deaths were directly linked to these anti-arrhythmic drugs?
I base my estimate on a definitive study done at the National Institutes of Health, and this study showed that over a year's time, this family of drugs killed about 6% of the heart patients being studied. When you spread that terrible death rate across the hundreds of thousands of patients for whom this family of drugs was prescribed and over the many years that they took it, you end up with a truly fearful, shattering death toll.
Well, we've been told that the reason it takes so long for a drug to get on the market is because the FDA really does demand an awful lot of safeguards before it's released. In fact, Newt Gingrich has described the FDA as a kind of an anti-job program because of that. So how did this drug come on the market?
One of the central points I try to make in Deadly Medicine is that, in fact, the drugs that millions of us take, particularly ones we take long-term, are not well enough tested. And as a consequence, we are taking terrible risks. And this is the story of one family of drugs that was never properly tested before it was given to hundreds of thousands of patients, and as a result, thousands of them died.
It was never properly tested. That means that it was released with the thought that it would not do what it did, or were there reasons for 3M and the other companies involved to maybe hold back a bit if they had been a bit more moral in their approach?
Here was the problem that came with this particular family of drugs. In its early testing, researchers learned that patients suddenly dropped dead soon after the drug was started. At least two manufacturers and possibly others had to halt testing and held worried meetings about why were patients dying on this drug.
Mm-hmm.
There was a second part of the story. The second part of the story is that the benefits of this drug were unproven. That is to say, researchers had a theory that treating very mild premature heartbeats would prevent very serious heart rhythm disturbances. No one had ever proved that was true. You add those two together and you have a recipe for the nation's worst drug disaster.
Well, we not only have 3M here, one of America's major corporations, but we have two of our leading drug manufacturers, DuPont and Bristol-Myers. Were they all working on this at the same time?
There was actually a flood of interest in the pharmaceutical industry. As many as 10 drug companies at least had them in development. 5 came onto the market about the same time. Tambicor, it was the leading one. It was thought to be the best. I feature it in the book not necessarily because it's the worst, but because it was the first of a new generation, and we can see just what they knew and, shockingly, what they didn't know.
But it's also the first drug that 3M ever introduced into the prescription drug market,
It was
wasn't
their
it?
first major bid to get a foothold in the pharmaceutical business.
So is there is that one of the determining factors here? 3M really trying to come up with something big, important to establish itself?
I believe, truthfully, this is how the pharmaceutical industry works. They all wanted to make profits from these drugs. Two ways to make money on a drug. Number one, to give it to as many patients as possible, and these included people who had very mild irregular heartbeats, so mild it took a doctor to even find them. Secondly, testing of the kind that would have been necessary to find out whether these drugs really saved lives was very expensive. Drug companies don't want to spend millions of dollars on testing if they can avoid it. They did in this case with tragic consequences.
But isn't that where the FDA comes in?
That is where the FDA comes in. The FDA is the agency that sets the standards. Most important thing the FDA does is to set the standards about how much clinical testing needs to be done to prove a drug is beneficial. In this case, the standards were too low. The really sad thing is that they often sat there in meetings and said, well, we really don't know whether this drug is going to save more people than it kills. And one of the parts that I think the readers will find most interesting in this book is watching the suspicion that these drugs were killers evolve over 5 years' time, and everybody getting more and more worried, but no one doing anything. And it really culminates just about the time that Tambacor is approved, when a very senior doctor at the FDA realizes that there were an unusually large number of patient deaths, and he wants to restrict the whole class of drugs.
Mm-hmm. Well, the FDA is such a stickler for getting things right. At least that's its reputation. That we have Newt Gingrich calling it a job killer. Is he wrong? Are we wrong? Or is this a special case here? Can we assume the same sort of thing is happening with other kinds of drugs?
Newt Gingrich is just plain wrong. He may have some criticisms about unburdensome relationships for some small medical devices, but when it comes to prescription drugs, we know that there are very significant perils and risks that we are taking because we don't test drugs better. Just go back 2 weeks ago and remember the story that was in the news all the way across the country. Calcium channel blockers. A reputable study suggested that calcium channel blockers, one of the most widely used blood pressure medications in the world, might cause heart attacks instead of doing what they were expected to do, prevent heart attacks. Now, I don't know whether that report is true, but what I know is we shouldn't be asking that question after millions of people are taking it. We should do it before.
You never come out and actually blame bribes as a reason here, but you do suggest that there's an awful lot of conflict of interest with some of the people involved at the FDA and the researching.
Conflict of interest lies at the heart of what I think went wrong. A group of experts at the medical schools and prominent research centers got too close to the drug industry. They were dependent upon the drug industry for funding for their laboratories. They became marquee professors and went around the country promoting the use of these drugs on the basis of this untested theory. And ironically, the FDA let these same people serve as the outside judges of the safety of these drugs. Had these people been more distant from the drug industry and more objective, they would have reacted to the clear dangers of these drugs much earlier.
When Tambacor came up for approval, you say 2 out of the 8 panel members had worked on this drug on some level.
Not only had they worked on this drug and had been involved in its drug testing, they had published gushingly enthusiastic articles about its properties, and in addition to that, the other committee members sort of deferred to them, thinking, well, these are the 2 doctors who know the most about it.
But would it be possible to do tests on a drug like this without getting people who've been implicated in its development?
Absolutely. Absolutely. What we need, the problem that our medical research centers in New York has one of the greatest establishments in the world. These people have gotten too close to the drug industry to become valid, independent judges of drugs. We need to have people who are not directly involved in these drugs, but who are experts on medical evidence. If you actually look at the votes, the people who vote against the approval of these drugs were people who were experts in data but were not involved in their development, who didn't have their careers at stake. Nowhere in our society do we allow such conflicts of interest. You wouldn't allow a defense general to be on the board of the company and be in charge of buying the weapons system. You could go to jail for that. And why we allow it in medicine is a mystery to me, but it is part of the reason why so many people died.
Thomas J. Moore is a senior fellow at George Washington University's Center for Health Policy Research. His book, Deadly Medicine, Why Tens of Thousands of Heart Patients Died in America's Worst Drug Disaster. It's from Simon & Schuster. Can you explain how antiarrhythmics actually work?
Antiarrhythmic drugs change the way the heart conducts an electrical impulse to contract. We all know we have a pump there pumping away in our bodies, but it is also a very sophisticated electrical entity, and an impulse to contract begins in a small node of tissue, and then through some specialized tissues it spreads down to the main pumping chambers of the hearts, and then a wave of electricity causes the heart to contract.
So why do you think that this would kill people? It may not do what it's supposed to do, but what evidence is it that it actually has a deleterious effect?
This family of drugs had a profound effect on the way that the heart, each muscle cell, conducted the impulse to contract. And apparently, rather than causing, if you will, a better, smoother electrical functioning, it became capable under certain circumstances of simply triggering an electrical breakdown of the heart, and people just died.
Why did cardiologists prescribe it in such huge amounts?
This is one of the core issues and arguments that I make in the book. Why did nearly half of the nation's doctors get themselves persuaded to prescribe drugs on the basis of an unproven theory for patients who mostly had no symptoms or complaints? And here's where we see the partnership between the drug industry, the medical research establishment, doing, if you will, its worst and risking lives, I believe, needlessly.
Let's take a call from a listener who has a very pressing personal problem in this regard. Elizabeth from Brooklyn, you're on New York and Company.
Thank you, Lennie. Oh, wait a minute. What do I do? Turn the radio off?
No, you're fine. Just tell us what you want to tell us.
Well, I just walked in. I'd gone to the pharmacy to have my prescription for Tambacor renewed. In fact, I had my coat on when I came in, and I hear this doctor talking about Tambacor.
He's not a doctor. He's a medical researcher and a medical investigative reporter. But how long have you been taking Tambacor?
I'm taking Tambacor, and I've been taking it probably, well over 2 years. And I have a long history of arrhythmia, paroxysmal, can't say the word, tachycardias.
I understand why you can't say those words. I avoid them. Well, Mr. Moore, obviously this works for some people.
Well, look, I'm taking Tambacor twice a day, and it's 100 milligram tablet. Now, of course, I'm terribly upset by what I'm hearing.
I have two answers for you. My first answer has to be that I really can't comment on an individual person and whether they should be taking this drug. I can say a second thing, that you shouldn't start or stop a drug without talking to your physician. I can give you a third piece of information. Tambacor is approved for people who have electrical disturbances of their heart that are life-threatening.
Well, I think that's what my condition is.
That are life-threatening. But if you have questions about this, I'd urge you to talk it over with your physician. If you're not sure,
Oh, I definitely will.
if you're not sure, you might also get an opinion from a cardiologist. I don't know if your cardiologist prescribed this or whether your internist did.
He's an internist specializing in cardiology.
Well, first you might want to read the book and then see if it applies to you. Okay?
What is the name of the book?
It's called Deadly Medicine. Thank you for that lead-in. And its subtitle is Why Tens of Thousands of Heart Patients Died in America's Worst Drug Disaster. We should also point out that many tens of thousands did not. There is no guarantee that this drug will have a negative effect. It's just that in some cases there seems to be a real problem. My guest is Thomas J. Moore. The book is published by Simon & Schuster, and we will continue our conversation right after this. Thank you so much for calling us, Elizabeth.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm David Brancaccio of Marketplace,
Well,
After the digital manipulations
I'm
used
not
in the movie
surprised.
Forrest Gump, many filmmakers have begun worrying that anyone who buys the copyright to their films may change their movies without their consent. Director Martin Scorsese tells us one needs to distinguish between films as commerce and films as art.
Of course.
That and the rest of the news affecting your money and the world economy today on Marketplace.
Tonight at 6:30 on WNYC, AM 820.
I'm Ray Suarez, host of NPR's Talk of the Nation. Would you like to tell me what's on your mind? Well, how about telling the whole country? On Talk of the Nation, we're eager to know what you think about presidential politics, popular culture,